The rise of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler remains one of the most studied and unsettling chapters in modern history. It wasn't just a German tragedy, it reshaped the entire world. Understanding how such a radical movement gained momentum isn't just about the past. It's a warning about the forces that can unmake societies. The impact of Hitler's rule extended far beyond Germany's borders. World War II killed over 55 million people, fractured empires, and redrew the global map. It left two superpowers standing, the United States and the Soviet Union, and set the stage for the Cold War. And within it all, the mechanized horror of the Holocaust became an eternal scar on human history. Yet, for all the destruction, fascination with the Third Reich persists. Historians write endlessly. Documentaries never stop. Why? Other regimes killed millions. Stalin, Pol Pot, the Rwandan genocide. But none seem to occupy the same mental space as Nazi Germany. Part of the reason is that Germany wasn't an isolated, struggling state. It was the land of Goethe and Beethoven, of universities and scientific advancement. This wasn't chaos rising from poverty. It was a sophisticated society that fell under the spell of hate. The Nazis didn't take power by force. In 1928, they were a fringe party. By 1932, they were the largest political force in Germany. What changed? The answer lies in a volatile mix of economic collapse, fear of communism, and disillusionment with democracy. Hitler's appeal was multi-layered. Some were true believers, those who embraced his ideology of racial supremacy, but millions more supported him for reasons less radical: desperation, fear, and hope. To the middle class, he promised stability. To workers, jobs. To farmers, higher prices. He told everyone what they wanted to hear. The Nazis didn't just use slogans. They used modern political machinery, mass rallies, film, radio, symbols, repetition. They turned propaganda into a science, wrapping totalitarianism in the trappings of national renewal. And once they had power, they moved fast. In the last free election of 1933, the Nazis got just over a third of the vote. But that was enough. Within months, opposition parties were banned. Trade unions dissolved. Dissent was crushed. The Weimar Republic, the democratic experiment that followed World War I, was gone. Totalitarianism took root. The Nazis blurred the line between public and private. Loyalty was demanded not just in public, but in schools, in homes, in whispers. Children pledged allegiance to Hitler. Neighbors informed on neighbors. The regime didn't just control laws, it tried to control thoughts. Why didn't more people resist? Some did, but fear kept many silent. And for others, the early years brought undeniable improvements. Jobs returned. Infrastructure projects soared. Germany's status on the world stage revived. For a time, the regime appeared to deliver, but the price was staggering. Hitler's racial ideology moved in stages: boycotts, segregation, deportation, and eventually, extermination. The Holocaust didn't come out of nowhere. It was a slow, brutal escalation, and the signs were visible. Some Germans resisted, but many complied. Some willingly, others numbly. The system didn't need everyone to believe. It just needed enough people to obey, and enough to look away. Understanding this era means removing hindsight. In the 1930s, Hitler's path didn't look like madness to everyone. It looked to some like hope. But that hope became catastrophe. And once it was too late, the machinery of terror was unstoppable. Studying Nazi Germany is not about obsession with evil. It's about clarity. It's about seeing how fragile democracy can be. how powerful propaganda is, and how quickly societies can be led astray by fear, division, and blind faith. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a mirror, and it's up to us to look into it carefully. To understand the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich, you must first understand what broke Germany. That breaking point began not with 1933, but with the First World War and the chaos it left behind. In 1914, Germany was a rising force. Recently unified, rapidly industrializing, it had surpassed even Britain in steel production and chemistry. But this growth came with deep fractures. Between rural and urban, old values and modern industry, aristocrats and workers. Beneath the surface, Germany was already trembling. By 1912, the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, had become the largest political force in the Reichstag, a Marxist labor party feared by conservatives and elites. It was a symptom of deeper unrest, a country split between its imperial traditions and its industrial present. When war broke out in 1914, it brought a temporary unity. The Kaiser called for Burgfrieden, a peace within the castle. Even the SPD supported the war effort. Germans believed the conflict would be swift, victorious, and glorious. They were wrong. By 1916, the war had consumed everything. Civilians starved. Cities rationed bread. Industry was commandeered for shells, not survival. The German military took control of the state, and social divides exploded. Small businesses collapsed. Farmers resented urban workers. Workers resented the army. Resentment became currency. And yet the press told a different story. Newspapers claimed victory was near, even as the casualty lists grew longer and longer. In truth, the war was a meat grinder, and Germany was running out of men and morale. In 1917, revolution swept Russia. The Bolsheviks pulled out of the war and began whispering to German troops, "Your real enemy is in Berlin, not in the trenches." Mutinies and strikes followed. The German High Command, desperate, launched one final offensive in 1918. It failed. The war ended not in battle, but in collapse. The Kaiser fled. A republic was declared, and an armistice was signed. To many Germans, it was a betrayal. The army hadn't been defeated in the field. It had been stabbed in the back by revolutionaries, pacifists, and politicians. This myth would be exploited ruthlessly in the years to come. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 poured salt into open wounds. Germany was forced to accept blame for the entire war, pay enormous reparations, and disarm. Its colonies were stripped, its borders redrawn. No party supported it, not the left, not the right, not the army, no one. Meanwhile, a fragile new democracy was born, the Weimar Republic. It granted universal suffrage, pioneered social welfare, and promised a new beginning. But it was cursed from the start. Spartacist uprisings, right-wing coups, political assassinations, hyperinflation, a tidal wave of crises. It was into this world of shattered pride and unrelenting uncertainty that a young Austrian veteran stepped forward. In 1919, Adolf Hitler attended a meeting of a small group called the German Workers' Party. He was assigned to spy on them. Instead, he joined them. He found his voice in their message: nationalist, anti-Marxist, anti-Semitic, convinced that Germany's defeat had been engineered by traitors within. Member number 555? From the wreckage of one war, another was being born, and its architect had just found his stage. The early years of the Weimar Republic were a crucible of violence, fear, and betrayal. Germany had lost the war, lost the Kaiser, and lost control of its own future. Into this void poured extremes, from the far left and the far right, and into that chaos stepped a man who would reshape the century. Formed in 1919, the Weimar Republic was born amid revolution and humiliation. Burdened by the Treaty of Versailles and the collapse of empire, it was fragile from the start. To many Germans, it was a puppet regime, an illegitimate state forced upon them by foreign powers. The military escaped blame for defeat. The politicians did not. Between 1919 and 1923, Germany spiraled into unrest. Political assassinations targeted liberal and socialist leaders. Right-wing paramilitaries carried out attacks with near impunity. Judges, many still loyal to the old order, gave lenient sentences, or none at all. Meanwhile, the young government focused its energy on crushing the left, especially the Communist Party. Revolts erupted across the map. In 1919, communist revolutionaries in Berlin were gunned down by government troops. In 1920, right-wing militarists staged a coup, only stopped when workers launched a general strike. Further uprisings broke out in the Ruhr and Rhineland, while inflation began to destroy the economy. In 1923, Germany teetered on the edge. The country was bleeding from war debt, international humiliation, and economic chaos. To pay for World War I, Germany had resorted to printing money. By late 1923, inflation had mutated into something apocalyptic. A single U.S. dollar was worth over 4 trillion marks. Prices changed by the hour. People were paid twice a day just to afford bread. Savings vanished overnight. Hyperinflation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. It shattered the middle class and fed an insatiable hunger for stability. From this smoke and disorder emerged a fringe movement in Munich, the German Workers' Party. It was nothing more than a discussion circle, until a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler walked in. Sent by the army to monitor it, Hitler was supposed to report on radicals. Instead, he found his future. His backstory was unremarkable, until it wasn't. Born in 1889, raised by a strict father and doting mother, Hitler had failed to gain entrance to art school and drifted through Vienna, selling postcards and living in flop houses. But in Vienna, he absorbed the city's virulent anti-Semitism and began to shape his worldview. When war broke out in 1914, Hitler found purpose. He joined the army, serving as a messenger between trenches. He was wounded, decorated, and blinded in a gas attack near the end. The defeat of Germany devastated him. While recovering, he heard the news. The Kaiser abdicated, a republic declared, and the war lost. That moment for Hitler became an origin myth. He did not blame military failure. He blamed politicians, socialists, and above all, Jews. After the war, Hitler stayed in the army, assigned to a propaganda unit. That assignment sent him to the German Workers' Party. He wasn't just captivated by their ideas, he transformed them. With charisma, rage, and a gift for oratory, he took control. The party was renamed the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. From the beginning, Nazi ideology fused ultranationalism, racism, and class appeal. Jews were cast as parasites, responsible for capitalism, communism, and national defeat. Class war was rejected. Instead, Hitler preached a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community beyond class lines, united by blood and purpose. By 1923, the Nazi Party was still mostly a Munich phenomenon, but it was growing. Then came hyperinflation. Foreign troops occupied the Ruhr. Bread cost billions of marks. People burned money for warmth. Inspired by Mussolini's march on Rome, Hitler made his move. In November 1923, he and his followers stormed a Munich beer hall, attempting to overthrow the Bavarian government in what became the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed. Police opened fire. Hitler was arrested. But what looked like the end was only the beginning. At his trial for treason in 1924, Hitler turned the courtroom into a stage. He painted himself as a patriot betrayed by weak politicians. The judges, sympathetic, gave him just 9 months in a comfortable prison. In prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, his manifesto. It laid out his worldview with terrifying clarity: Aryan supremacy, hatred of Jews, contempt for democracy, and dreams of conquest in the East. When he emerged, Hitler was no longer just a failed revolutionary. He was a national figure, and the chaos of the early Weimar years had given him something more dangerous than power: a story, one that millions were now willing to hear. The Republic had survived the crisis, but its greatest threat had just begun to prepare. He emerged in 1924 with a new strategy. Revolution wouldn't come through violence, but through elections, propaganda, and manipulation. The late 1920s, however, were not fertile ground for extremism. Thanks to the Dawes Plan and American loans, Germany's economy stabilized. The Weimar Republic entered a short-lived golden age. Berlin flourished with art, science, and culture. The Nazis faded into the margins. In the 1928 election, the Nazis won just 2.6% of the vote. They were mocked, irrelevant, an angry footnote. But the Republic's stability was an illusion. It rested on borrowed time and borrowed money. In 1929, the Wall Street crash triggered a global depression. America called in its loans. German industry collapsed. Banks shuttered. By 1932, 1 in 3 Germans was unemployed. The Weimar government fractured. Coalitions failed. Parliament became a battlefield of shouting matches and walkouts. This was the storm Hitler had been waiting for. Under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda became a machine. While other political movements rose and fell between elections, the Nazi Party never stopped moving. They didn't just campaign. They occupied the public space: rallies, parades, street confrontations, and constant propaganda. They made it feel inevitable. Their victory wasn't just possible, it felt ordained. Tailored messaging targeted every demographic: to workers, jobs; to farmers, price protection; to nationalists, revenge; to the middle class, restored dignity. The Nazis didn't just offer policies, they offered identity. Unlike traditional parties, which surfaced only during elections, the Nazi machine was relentless. Every speech, every banner, every uniform reinforced the message: we are the future. In 1930, they surged to 18.3% of the vote, a political earthquake. The Nazis were now the second largest party in Germany. Parliament descended into gridlock. The chancellor at the time, Heinrich Brüning, imposed brutal austerity measures, cutting welfare, raising taxes. It only deepened the pain. As moderates floundered, Hitler never stopped campaigning. Every day was an election, every crisis a stepping stone. By 1932, Germany was no longer a functioning democracy. Rule by emergency decree became the norm. Street battles between Nazis and communists raged nightly, and the Nazi Party stood at the gates of power. The Republic had not yet fallen, but its pillars had cracked, and the man who once failed in a Munich beer hall was now a national contender, ready to seize the moment. The Great Depression didn't just destroy Germany's economy, it destroyed its defenses. A critical test came with the presidential election of 1932. The incumbent was Paul von Hindenburg, a decorated war hero beloved by conservatives. Hitler's decision to challenge him seemed reckless. Many elites still saw the Nazis as street thugs, not statesmen. But Hitler understood the power of a national stage, and his campaign was unlike anything Germany had ever seen. Joseph Goebbels orchestrated the spectacle. Posters, leaflets, rallies, and films blanketed the country. Tailored messaging reached every profession. Teachers, farmers, civil servants, war widows. No group was ignored. The Nazis even pioneered direct mail, sending personalized letters that appeared to come from within a voter's own community. And at the center of it all, Hitler himself. He flew to multiple cities per day. The first candidate in history to campaign by airplane, he became omnipresent. Organizers turned his rallies into theater, lights, drums, silence before the speech, then thunderous cheers. It was politics as performance, and it worked. Despite the Blitz, Hindenburg still won, barely avoiding an outright majority in the first round. In the runoff, Hitler gained ground, but lost again. Hindenburg won 53% to Hitler's 36%. But Hitler didn't need to win. The real prize was legitimacy. Overnight, he became the second most powerful political figure in Germany. The man once arrested for treason was now a national contender. The momentum didn't stop. In regional elections across Germany, the Nazis surged, especially in places like Prussia and Bavaria, where local governments once treated them as a fringe cult. No longer. Meanwhile, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, already ruling by emergency decree, lost favor. His economic austerity deepened the suffering. Behind the scenes, military leaders and industrialists began looking for alternatives. They were done with democracy. In May 1932, Brüning was ousted. His replacement, Franz von Papen, a well-meaning aristocrat with little political instinct. Papen believed he could tame the Nazis, use them for conservative ends. He was wrong. In the July 1932 Reichstag elections, the Nazis exploded, 37.3% of the vote. They were now the largest party in the country. Hitler demanded the chancellorship. Hindenburg refused. He hated Hitler, calling him a Bohemian corporal unfit to lead. But now the Reichstag was deadlocked. The Nazis and Communists together held a majority, but refused to cooperate. Governance collapsed. A second election was held in November 1932. This time, Nazi support dipped down to 33%. For the first time, their momentum wavered. Funding dried up. Morale slipped. A secret memo from Goebbels warned, if we do not seize power soon, we may never do so. At the moment of apparent weakness, everything changed. Behind the scenes, Papen and other conservatives plotted. They believed they could harness Hitler's popularity, surround him with loyal ministers, and keep him on a leash. They pressured Hindenburg to make the appointment, and on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. They believed they were using Hitler. In truth, they had just handed him the keys to the Republic. A coalition was formed, just 3 Nazis in key positions, Hitler, Göring, and Frick. But those roles gave the Nazis control of Prussia's police and the Interior Ministry. That meant control over violence. Hitler moved fast. One of his first acts was to dissolve the Reichstag and call for new elections on March 5th. But before the campaign could begin, disaster or opportunity struck. On February 27th, the Reichstag building caught fire. A young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene. The Nazis blamed the Communist Party. Whether von der Lubbe acted alone or not remains debated. But the Nazis exploited the moment with ruthless precision. The very next day, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. It suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, the press. Police could now detain anyone without trial. Overnight, Germany became a state of terror. Over 10,000 communists and socialists were arrested in Prussia alone. Newspapers were shut down, opponents vanished, and when March elections came, Nazi intimidation ruled the streets. Even then, the Nazis did not win a majority. They secured 44% of the vote. But with their conservative allies in the Nationalist Party, they controlled the Reichstag. It was enough. On March 23rd, Hitler presented the Enabling Act, a law granting his cabinet the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval. It needed a two-thirds majority. The Nazis banned communist deputies and intimidated others. Surrounded by SA thugs, the remaining delegates passed it. The Enabling Act changed everything. Hitler no longer needed elections, coalitions, or consent. He ruled by decree. Within weeks, trade unions were abolished. By July 1933, all opposition parties were banned. Germany was now a one-party state. The press, radio, schools, and courts came under Nazi control. Propaganda painted Hitler as the savior of the nation. But not all threats came from outside. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, had become a powerful paramilitary force, millions strong. Röhm wanted the SA to become the new army, a vision that terrified the conservative military establishment. Hitler needed their loyalty. In June 1934, he struck. The purge became known as the Night of the Long Knives. SA leaders were arrested and executed. Röhm was shot. Dozens of others, old rivals, critics, even conservatives, were eliminated. Hitler justified it as defending the state. The army got the message. And when President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler moved instantly. He merged the offices of President and Chancellor. The military was ordered to swear loyalty not to the Constitution, not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler himself. Germany had ceased to be a republic. By the end of 1934, it was a dictatorship, complete, absolute, and terrifying in its efficiency. And the world had barely begun to understand what was coming. The Nazi regime now had total control, and it wasted no time in reshaping Germany from the inside out. This was more than a dictatorship. It was a totalitarian state. The line between public and private life dissolved. Citizens were expected to think, act, and even feel according to Nazi ideology. At the center of Nazi belief was race. Hitler's worldview saw history through a racial lens. Germans as the master race, Jews as parasites, and other groups as inferior. Policies were no longer judged on legality or morality, but on whether they served the regime's racial goals. Propaganda made it all feel normal. The media was tightly controlled. Radio, newspapers, film, every outlet pushed the Nazi narrative. Germany's achievements were exaggerated. Problems were blamed on outsiders or traitors. Truth became whatever the regime needed it to be. But where propaganda failed, terror stepped in. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, could arrest anyone without warning. They operated without warrants, trials, or appeals. In 1933, the first concentration camps opened. Dachau became a testing ground for how to detain and break political opponents. People lived in fear. Friends stopped trusting each other. Children were taught to report their parents. No one knew who might be listening or what might be punished. The Nazis also restructured society itself. From youth groups to professional guilds, every German was expected to join a Nazi organization. Boys entered the Hitler Youth, trained in obedience and militarism. Girls joined the League of German Girls, taught to serve the nation through motherhood. Social life revolved around Nazi holidays, rallies, and ceremonies. Opposition didn't just seem dangerous, it seemed unnatural. Anti-Semitism, long a feature of Nazi ideology, became central to government policy. In the early years, the approach was methodical. On April 1st, 1933, the regime launched a national boycott of Jewish businesses. It failed after a day, but harsher measures followed. Jews were banned from the civil service, universities, medicine, and law. Jewish students were pushed out of schools. Naturalized Jews, many from Eastern Europe, lost their citizenship. At first, Hitler moved cautiously. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were approaching, and international opinion still mattered. But in 1935, the Nazis made their racial agenda law. The Nuremberg Laws stripped Jews of citizenship and outlawed marriage or sexual contact between Jews and Aryans. Bureaucrats were left to define who counted as Jewish, leading to confusing racial categories and Kafkaesque investigations into ancestry. From 1935 to 1938, Nazi policy pushed Jews to emigrate. The SS led this effort, harassing Jewish citizens, making life unbearable. But most countries refused to accept refugees. For many, there was no way out. By 1938, persecution escalated. Jewish assets were cataloged for future seizure. The message was clear. The regime was preparing for something bigger. Then came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On November 9th to 10th, 1938, Nazi stormtroopers rampaged through Jewish neighborhoods. Synagogues burned. Businesses were smashed. Thousands of men were arrested and sent to camps. This was no random riot. It was the first coordinated nationwide act of state violence against Jews. Nazi racial policy didn't stop with Jews. The Roma were targeted. So were the disabled, who were sterilized under the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. Anyone deemed genetically impure became a target. These policies weren't chaotic, they were calculated. The regime moved in steps: isolate, strip rights, encourage flight, then attack. And when war came, those steps would end in genocide. This was how total control was built, not overnight, but piece by piece. And the world still hadn't seen the worst of what was coming. Between 1933 and 1938, Hitler's foreign policy was one of his most popular triumphs. While many Germans harbored doubts about his domestic policies, few could deny the momentum he brought to Germany's global standing. He had promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, and he delivered. The Nazi regime's foreign policy was both pragmatic and ideological. Practically, it aimed to undo the humiliations of Versailles, rebuild the German military, and re-establish sovereignty. Ideologically, it pursued Lebensraum, living space, a racial and territorial mission to expand eastward, especially into Eastern Europe. This wasn't just about land, it was about destroying Judeo-Bolshevism and creating a self-sufficient German empire. Publicly, Hitler wore the mask of peace. He claimed Germany only wanted equality among nations, the right to defend itself. It was a message that resonated at home and abroad. Even in Britain and France, many viewed the Treaty of Versailles as unjust, and Hitler's early moves seemed like overdue corrections. His first step came in 1933, when Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, protesting what he called biased treatment. Domestically, it was a propaganda coup. Germany was no longer begging for respect. It was demanding it. Then, in 1935, the Saar region, under international control since World War I, voted in a plebiscite to rejoin Germany. Over 90% of voters supported reunification. It was bloodless and wildly popular. That same year, Hitler dropped the charade. He announced rearmament, openly violating Versailles. He restored conscription, unveiled a new Luftwaffe, and ordered tanks back into production. Britain and France issued protests, but no action followed. In 1936, he made his boldest move yet, the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The region had been demilitarized to protect France. German generals warned that France might retaliate. Hitler rolled the dice. French troops never moved. Britain urged restraint. The lesson was clear. The Allies would not intervene. That same year, Germany and Italy drew closer, backing Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. The groundwork for the Axis alliance was laid in blood and ideology. By 1938, Hitler was adored by many Germans. His economic policies had reduced unemployment. His foreign policy delivered national pride. Then came the next step, Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. When the Austrian government hesitated, Hitler sent in troops. They met no resistance. Crowds in Vienna greeted them with flowers. Within days, Austria was absorbed into the Reich. No shots fired, no reprisals. Now emboldened, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia. His target, the Sudetenland, home to ethnic Germans. He claimed they were persecuted. Tensions escalated. Europe held its breath. In September 1938, Britain and France met Hitler at the Munich Conference. No Czech representative was invited. France, still haunted by the horrors of World War I, hesitated. Britain, under Neville Chamberlain, was determined to avoid another conflict at all costs. Chamberlain believed diplomacy could hold the line. In September 1938, he flew to Berchtesgaden to meet Hitler face to face. Hitler assured him that the Sudetenland was all he wanted, that beyond this he had no more territorial ambitions. It was a lie. Chamberlain returned home optimistic and convinced France to support a negotiated settlement. But when he met Hitler again in Bad Godesberg, everything changed. Hitler now demanded not just the Sudetenland, but immediate military occupation and broader claims on Czech territory. The mask was slipping. Despite growing alarm, Britain and France still refused to take a stand. On September 29th, Hitler, Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini met in Munich. No Czech official was invited. Their fate was decided without their voice. The agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany without resistance. In exchange, Hitler once again promised it would be his final demand. Chamberlain returned to London to waving crowds and declared he had secured peace for our time. But beneath the surface, the illusion was already breaking. The world was hurtling toward disaster, and Hitler believed no one would stop him. In March 1939, Hitler shattered his promises. German forces marched into Prague, occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. No German minority to defend, no excuse of self-determination, just conquest. Appeasement had failed. Britain and France, humiliated, began to reassess. They issued new guarantees to Poland, to others. But for Hitler, the message was clear. The West would not fight. He had gained territory, crushed a sovereign nation, and paid no price. Inside Germany, Hitler's popularity soared. Even skeptical army generals saw him as a genius strategist. Plans to remove him evaporated. The military closed ranks. Obedience replaced doubt. Munich had also shaped global diplomacy. To Stalin, the Soviet dictator, it confirmed his worst fears. Britain and France had sacrificed Czechoslovakia without a fight. He believed they were pushing Hitler eastward, hoping Nazi Germany and the USSR would destroy each other. That suspicion would lead to a fateful decision. In August 1939, Stalin signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact, carving Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. It was a cynical calculation and a death sentence for Poland. The Munich Agreement didn't stop a war. It guaranteed one. It convinced Hitler that the democracies were weak, that they would always choose peace over principle, that he could keep going. And less than a year later, he did. What the world thought was a diplomatic triumph was actually the moment the countdown began. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. For the second time in a generation, Europe was at war. But this time, the conflict erupted from a dangerous miscalculation. Hitler had assumed that Britain and France, cowed by appeasement and haunted by the Great War, would back down again. He was wrong. On September 3rd, both nations declared war. The Second World War had begun, and Germany was not ready for the war it had just unleashed. Despite the risk, the invasion of Poland was a triumph of military innovation. Hitler unveiled Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a strategy combining armored thrusts with air power to overwhelm enemy forces quickly. Polish troops fought bravely, but they were outmatched. Within weeks, Warsaw was encircled and battered by relentless bombing. By October 2nd, Poland had fallen, the city lay in ruins, and the world had witnessed the dawn of total war, where civilians were no longer spared. But something unexpected happened. Britain and France declared war, yet did little. This strange lull between declarations and actual fighting became known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg. On the surface, it was calm. Underneath, Europe braced for impact. Hitler used the time to regroup. He offered peace talks to Britain, hoping to isolate them diplomatically. But Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, stung by Munich, refused any deal unless Germany withdrew from Poland. The answer was clear. There would be no repeat of 1938. In April 1940, Hitler struck again, this time in the north. Denmark fell in a day. Norway followed weeks later after a fierce fight. Hitler had secured access to Swedish iron in northern ports, but this was only the beginning. In May 1940, the real offensive began. Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, then swung through the Ardennes, a forest the French had considered impassable. Blitzkrieg tore through defenses. The Maginot Line was outflanked. French and British forces were trapped. The retreat ended in Dunkirk, where over 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated by a flotilla of military and civilian vessels. It was hailed as a miracle, but it was also a defeat. Nearly all heavy equipment was lost. The Allies had barely escaped. France stood alone, and soon not even that. In just 6 weeks, France collapsed. German troops marched into Paris on June 14, 1940. On June 22nd, an armistice was signed, in the same rail car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had his revenge. Western Europe had fallen. Only Britain stood defiant. Unable to launch an invasion, Hitler turned to the skies. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe targeted airfields and radar stations, but the Royal Air Force, outgunned and outnumbered, held firm. When air superiority couldn't be achieved, the strategy shifted. The Blitz began, bombing campaigns aimed at breaking civilian morale. Cities burned, thousands died, but Britain never surrendered. Frustrated, Hitler changed direction. Though Germany had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin in 1939, Hitler had always planned to break it. He saw the Soviet Union not as a partner, but as the ideological and racial enemy. Judeo-Bolshevism to be annihilated, and its land, the key to German Lebensraum, living space for the master race. On December 18, 1940, Hitler issued Directive Number 21, Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched the largest invasion in human history, over 3 million troops across a 1,800-mile front. The initial shock was devastating. Soviet airfields were destroyed. Entire armies were encircled. By autumn, the Wehrmacht had reached the gates of Moscow, but the Soviet Union didn't break. The Russian winter struck. German troops lacked warm clothing, engines froze, logistics collapsed, and then the Red Army counterattacked. German forces were pushed back. It was the first major failure of the Blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Now the war was truly global, and Germany was at the center of it, fighting on 3 fronts against 3 superpowers. What began as a gamble for regional dominance had become a fight for survival, and the tide was starting to turn. The Holocaust was not an accident of war. It was the culmination of Nazi ideology, rooted in anti-Semitism, racial pseudoscience, and a belief in Aryan supremacy. Hitler's rhetoric became reality through a systematized bureaucratic machine built to exterminate. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it didn't just gain territory, it gained control over millions of Jews. The Nazis had long talked of exclusion, deportation, and separation. Now they had the geography, manpower, and political cover to carry out something far more sinister. At first, Nazi policy focused on segregation. Jews were forced into overcrowded ghettos, disease-ridden, starved, cut off from the outside world. These weren't just holding areas. They were pressure chambers of suffering. Heinrich Himmler, tasked with German racial policy, delegated Jewish affairs to Reinhard Heydrich. Deportation was the original plan, but as Nazi control spread, especially after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, deportation gave way to murder. The invasion of the USSR wasn't just military, it was ideological. Hitler saw it as a war against Judeo-Bolshevism. Behind the Wehrmacht came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads. Their orders: execute Jews, communists, Roma, and any so-called undesirables. But even mass shootings were deemed too slow and too psychologically damaging for the killers. The regime sought efficiency. Bureaucrats began planning something colder, more mechanized. In January 1942, top Nazi officials convened at the Wannsee Conference. Over lunch and fine wine, they coordinated the final solution, the plan to systematically murder all Jews in Europe. This was not chaos. It was logistics, rail schedules, quotas, facilities. The plan became reality in extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Jews were deported from every corner of occupied Europe: France, Hungary, Greece, the Netherlands. Most were killed upon arrival, gassed in chambers using Zyklon B. Those deemed fit for labor were worked until death. Others were used for medical experiments. Children were not spared. Every death was recorded, processed, tallied. This was genocide by design. The scale defies comprehension. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews had been murdered. So too were hundreds of thousands of Roma, the disabled Soviet POWs and political prisoners. The Holocaust was not just about numbers. It was about erasure of communities, cultures, languages, and lives. Entire towns were wiped from existence, cemeteries desecrated, synagogues torched. Despite reports reaching the Allies as early as 1942, the response was slow. Many dismissed the scale as exaggerated. Only with liberation did the full horror emerge. And still, the world struggled to comprehend. The Holocaust wasn't just the work of a few fanatics. It required collaboration, silence, and complicity. Local police, railway officials, informants. Across Europe, thousands helped make it possible. For profit, for ideology, or simply out of fear. It is a story not only of evil, but of warning. The Holocaust shows how a modern state can harness science, law, and industry to commit genocide. It shows how propaganda can prepare a population to accept and even participate in atrocity. This wasn't ancient history. It was yesterday, and its lessons are urgent. As the Third Reich began to collapse, its brutality did not. In fact, the final phase of the Holocaust may have been its cruelest. With Allied forces closing in from the west and the Soviet Red Army from the east, the Nazis moved to erase the evidence of genocide and to kill as many as they could before their time ran out. These were the death marches. In early 1945, as camps in Poland and Eastern Europe were evacuated, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to march westward. Many were already sick, starving, and barefoot. They were shot if they slowed, shot if they fell, shot for no reason at all. Some marched hundreds of miles. Others froze to death in fields. Entire columns vanished. At the same time, the Nazis accelerated their efforts to destroy documentation, dismantle crematoria, and burn bodies. Files were shredded, buildings blown up. Even as Germany crumbled, the bureaucracy of genocide remained disturbingly precise, but they couldn't hide everything. As Soviet troops pushed west, they reached Majdanek in July 1944. Unlike later camps, Majdanek hadn't been fully evacuated. The world got its first clear look at the Nazi killing machine. Gas chambers, crematoriums, rooms stacked with shoes and human hair. The West would soon follow. In April 1945, American forces liberated Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. British troops reached Bergen-Belsen. What they found stunned even battle-hardened soldiers, skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, the stench of death woven into the soil. Footage from the camps was filmed, documented, and shown to the public. For many Germans, it was the first undeniable proof of what had been done in their name. General Eisenhower, after visiting Ohrdruf, insisted on bringing journalists and local officials to witness the horror. He said, "Let the world see. Let it never be forgotten." And the world did see. In the months that followed, thousands of survivors gave testimony. Children, twins, doctors, musicians, rabbis, professors, each one with a story of loss, resilience, and survival. Many had lost their entire families. Some didn't know if they were the last of their community. Even as camps were liberated, the suffering didn't end. Thousands died after liberation, from starvation, disease, and untreated wounds. Allied forces tried to provide food and care, but recovery would take years. In November 1945, the world began to reckon with what had happened. The Nuremberg trials brought top Nazi officials to justice. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity were prosecuted in an international court. Testimonies Documents and film footage were used to present an irrefutable case, but many perpetrators escaped. Some fled abroad. Others simply blended into post-war Europe. It would take decades of pursuit and investigation to bring some of them to justice. The liberation of the camps did more than expose the Holocaust. It gave birth to a new global awareness. The word genocide entered legal language. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. The world had looked into an abyss and resolved, at least in principle, not to return. The Holocaust did not end when the camps were freed. It ended when the killing stopped and the remembering began.